And now it's good afternoon again to Jim O'Hagan.
A while ago, Walter, I sketched for your listeners the story of William Dargan and Dargan's Island, the pleasure park of Belfast, won from the sea in the 19th century. Today I'd like to dwell for a while on another pleasure place in the city, and one in which people gathered for fun or a ramble before and after the time of Dargan's Island. That place is the Cavehill in Bellevue. It is a site rich in history and folklore, and contains, I'm sure, some memories of days gone by for many people. The ancient name of the Cavehill was Ben Madigan, which according to one translation is the mountain head of the red dogs or foxes, and at its height is approximately 1,142 feet above sea level. At the top there is MacArt's Fort, called after Brian MacArt O'Neill of Lower Clandyboy, who was a local chieftain of the 16th century, whose clan lost their lands in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. MacArt's Fort was one of their last strongholds. There was, too, away in the past, a stone chair or throne situated at the top of the hill near the fort. This chair was used at the crowning of the O'Neills. However, long after their time, in 1896, it was vandalised and sent rolling over the cliff face, where it smashed on the rocks below. This throne gave its name to a large house at the top of the Whitewell Road nearby, which is still there, and for many years was known as the Throne Hospital or Convalescent Home. It was formerly the residence of Sir Samuel Ferguson, the famous man of letters, who wrote about this district, as I will relate in a moment or two. Controversy to an extent surrounds the throne of the O'Neills, as in 1750 the then sovereign of Belfast, Stuart Banks, found a stone chair at Castlereagh, which some maintained was the clan's throne. Banks had it built into the wall of the Belfast Butter Market, where it remained for many years before being removed to the museum. However, Cahill O'Byrne, the noted historian of Belfast's past, refutes this second stone as the real throne, and relies on the authority of Ferguson, who always referred to the Cavehill stone as the authentic one. Walter, there are 5 caves cut out of the face of the cliff, hence the popular name Cavehill, and they are all artificially formed by whom we do not know. Sir Samuel Ferguson wrote a story set in the 15th century named Corby MacGilmore, in which the upper caves were used as a treasure house and a prison, whilst the lowest one was a smith's forge. But we have no definitive proof of them having ever been used for these ends or for any other. The first cave on the level of the ground can be reached fairly easily. 75 feet up on a ledge is the second cave, and the third is approximately 130 feet from the ground and to the west of the first. The fourth and fifth can be reached from the third. Apart from the first, it is a dangerous climb to the others, and should not be attempted in a foolhardy fashion, as many people over the years have died in the attempt. Ness O'Hahan, the famous highwayman of the past from the Braid Valley, it is said, used the caves as a hideout for his gang. But again, we have no real historical evidence of this. We do know, however, that Wolfe Tone, one of the leaders of the 1798 Rising, and some like-minded friends climbed to MacArt's Fort prior to the Rising and vowed they would never rest until Ireland had been wrested from England. Also, one of the leaders of that rising, Henry Joy McCracken, a Belfast man, had a love relationship with a young girl called Mary Bodell, or Bothwell as some would pronounce the name, whose family lived on the Cavehill. Apparently they married in secret, according to Cavehill, and a child was born to the couple. After McCracken's execution in Belfast in 1798, his wife went to America, and the child was reared by Henry's sister Mary Ann, a lady who was a leading light in the Belfast Charitable Society for many years. Another story, and a tragic one, concerns two cousins, James and Richard Whiteside, who lived and were brought up together in the Cavehill district. They were Presbyterians and close boyhood friends who had taken opposite sides at the time of the 98 Rising. James joined the United Men, whilst Richard was an Orangeman and a member of the Yeomanry, who were fighting the United Men. After the Battle of Antrim, which the United Men lost, James escaped and, exhausted, made his way home. Near home he met Richard, and feeling safe, told him how he had escaped. Whereupon, without a word or sign of recognition or family feeling, Richard took aim with his musket and shot James dead. It is said that Richard was rewarded for this act not by censure, but by receiving his dead cousin's land. Such were the times then, and the bitterness which that conflict engendered. On a happier note, the Cavehill from the early 19th century onwards was a place where Belfast people gathered regularly for leisure and for rambos, the view there being especially picturesque. Easter was a particular time of the year for such pursuits. On that day, remembered by William Reid in his poem of 1818, entitled Hill of Caves, he speaks of the people, and I quote, "On foot, on steed, coach, a jingle cart or car, towards the high hill of caves they wend their way." Fiddlers and bagpipers accompanied the throng as they gathered on the plateau and played games and danced and sang until nightfall. Later a harper might be heard serenading them as they descended. Cavehill talks about the young men of Belfast wearing white duck trousers on Easter Mondays. Apparently it was not proper to be as flashily dressed at any other time, as folk would remark to anyone who did so that they were taking a turn out of their Easter Mondays. There were food stalls erected and yellow man and cockles and mussels sold. Later the reputation of the place suffered due to illegal drinking and gambling taking place. The churches railed against this, and respectable people avoided it. However, even by 1845, 20,000 people still attended the festivities on the hill on Easter Monday. But by then Dargan's Island in the Belfast docks was seen and used by many as a more suitable alternative. Towards the end of the 19th century, and with by then the coming of the horse trams, the Cavehill came into its own again as somewhere to go. The Belfast Street Tramways Company, which was privately owned, came into being in 1872 and had as its general manager from 1881 Andrew Nonce. By then the lines from the city centre to the Antrim Road only ran as far as Chichester Park, and in 1882 the Cavehill and Whitewell Tram Company commenced to run from there to Glengormley. Incidentally, Nonce named the city centre terminus as Castle Junction in 1884. The lines for the horse trams to Glengormley were situated on the seaward side of the road, and their stable had approximately 30 horses. The working life of a horse on this line varied from 4 to 6 years. In 1892, the Belfast Street Tramways Company had 800 horses. By 1905, the Belfast Corporation had taken over the running of the Belfast horse tram system, and the last horse-drawn vehicle ran in December 1905. The system was then electrified. Cavehill and Whitewell electrified their system soon after. But by 1911, an amalgamation of the Belfast system and the Cavehill operation had taken place, and the two systems were joined together by lines which ran from the centre of the road. Belfast Corporation Tramways now had responsibility for the complete run to Glengormley. From the closing decades of the 19th century, there had been a smaller pleasure garden on the site of the present zoological complex, run by the Glengormley General Recreation Company. This had been acquired by the Cavehill and Whitewell Tram Company in the 1890s, and in turn was taken over by Belfast Corporation Tramways prior to World War I. And so Mr. Nonce's dream of a fun and pleasure complex here came to fruition and became the basis of Bellevue and Hazelwood Plateau that many of us know and loved so well. At the turn of the 20th century, Walter, Glengormley and other places did a good trade in selling drink on Sundays, due to the law which allowed travellers to purchase alcohol if they had travelled more than 3 miles. So in those days, many travelled from the city on that day, and we had the quaint situation of the publicans having to ask customers, "Where is your abode, and did you sleep there last night?" This greeting became the perfunctory, "Are you bona fide?" and patrons were allowed in if they answered yes. When the Belfast Tramways took over the site of the old Glengormley Gardens, they greatly developed it during the 1920s, and by then had the famous entrance steps built. The name Bellevue was given to the complex in 1912 or 1913 by Nonce, who was also instrumental in acquiring the adjacent Hazelwood estate to widen the scope of the recreational activities. Hazelwood cost £7,000 to purchase. But it was from the early 1930s that the place really assumed the character that some of your listeners may well remember today, with its zoo, extensive amusements, toast track buses, donkey rides, miniature railway, and of course the Floral Hall. I have already spoken of the zoo on an earlier occasion, so today I'd like to recall briefly some of the other activities. Mr. Harry Kamaya, who was associated with the Belfast theatrical agent Harvey Wilton and who was based in Blackpool, was in 1933 given the contract to provide amusements, and with the help of his brother Monzo, installed and operated water dodgems, auto scooter cars, tunnel railway, kitty whip and roundabouts. The contractors were Haymarket Amusements, and they were all driven by electricity. Also installed the next year were additional features. The contract was for 7 years to end in 1941, with a further 3-year extension option. The amusements were closed on Sundays. I wonder, Walter, do many of the listeners remember any of these, especially the miniature railway system, set up with carriages pulled by an engine called the Bug, which Mr. Kamaya had bought from the Romney, Hythe and Dymchurch Railways, the RH&D. It arrived in Belfast on board the Hesham steamer on the 21st of March 1934. The line, which was put down on a 15-inch gauge, had 2 stations called Bellhazel and Bellevue Park at each end of the line. It ran along the inner edge of the plateau on a system with 2 tight balloon loops. Bellhazel was the terminus and service area and had 2 buildings which were painted white with black lining. Advertising signs included Lyons tea and Gallagher cigarettes, and there were some slot machines where chocolates could be obtained. At the Whitewell end was Bellevue Park. Barney Kane was the engine driver. During its lifetime, the Bug had 2 later names, being called Sir Crawford and Jean. Sir Crawford came from the name of the Lord Mayor of the city, who opened the line in 1934, whilst Jean was, I understand, the name of Mr. Kamaya's daughter. I'm sure that some of your listeners will remember the toast rack buses which took visitors to the zoo and the amusements on the plateau. They were called toast racks because of the way the seating on them was provided in rows parallel to the front of the vehicles. Open sides and running boards were features as well. The departure stand was situated near the Hazelwood entrance on the Antrim Road on sloping ground. Thus, to start them, the drivers needed only to let off the handbrake. The gradient to the top was 1 in 6, and in some places 1 in 5, so a steep climb was the prospect of passengers using them on the 1/4 mile ride along the avenue, as it was called, to the top. The toast tracks were rather bumpy as they rattled along, and if the weather was dry, the ride was often dusty. The service was introduced in 1933, with William Denby and Company supplying the vehicles, which had 20-inch solid tyres. Later, Dennis vehicles were used, and later still, the Sun Saloon Body Company of Birmingham supplied them. They lasted for some 20 years until the early 1950s. And they were replaced by more conventional single-decker buses. This bus service to the plateau was discontinued in 1962. It's interesting, Walter, that if one speaks about the Bellevue of the old days to people these days, the first thing they invariably will reminisce about are the toast racks. The Tramways Committee was well aware that the patrons of the Bellevue Plateau needed to be fed during their visits, and so made provision for this. The Cosy Cafe had been established in the 1920s under the supervision of a Mrs. Park. Later in the early 30s, it became the Bungalow Cafe. Also here was Cafe Hazelwood, which again, like its counterpart, had dated from the 20s, but was given a refurbishment in 1936, when the Northern Whig, amongst others, spoke of its culinary attractions as well as the views over Belfast Lough and surrounding area afforded from its windows. In the 1930s, a company called Tuck Shops Limited, under the superintendence of a Mr. McNutt, was given charge of the catering. Young boys in the summer holidays could earn 5 shillings per week as strolling vendors, selling fruit and ice cream. Their hours of work were long, though. As well, they were employed leading donkeys for kitty rides and general tidying up of litter, and wiping the seats of the bandstand dry after rain, whilst waiting for the next performance. I suppose if one thinks about it, the Bellevue complex in the heyday of the amusements and associated goings-on, along with the zoo, was a sort of Alton Towers, which today in England attracts thousands of visitors as a theme pleasure park. One could not overlook the Floral Hall in any discussion about the Cavehill and Bellevue. Dancing had taken place in the 1920s, but the opening of the Floral Hall and the refurbished Hazelwood Cafe on the 5th of May 1936 gave an added impetus to this form of enjoyable recreation, and many will remember it as a place where they met their future wives or husbands. Names like Fred Hanna's band and many others of the show band era will come to mind as they remember some of the hopefully enchanted evenings spent there. The main contractor of the hall was J. and R. W. Taggart, Belfast, and the total cost, including the fitting out, amounted to approximately £15,000. It could comfortably seat 1,000 people when used as a concert hall or theatre, and for a time many plays and variety concerts were staged there, being circular in design, 85 feet in diameter. Companies which appeared in 1939 included the White Blackbirds, Summer Fair, Lollipop Follies and the Bangor Entertainers. In the late 1930s, visitors could meet Michael Moores, a greeter on the plateau, who at the reputed age of 124 was billed as the world's oldest man. There too was Sarah Gunna, a thrilling stuntman who was fired from a cannon, lifted pianos with his jaws and teeth, and slid down a 500-feet wire rope hanging on by his teeth. Naturally, his acts were great spectacles and extremely popular. With the coming of the Second War, events continued on the plateau during daylight hours only. The Floral Hall was blacked out for functions held in it. From 1941, Philip Gordon took over the running of the complex. He was to stay until 1949, but by then the place had become quite run down, and many of the attractions were sold off by public auction. Miss Pauline Barry, in 1951, became the lessee of the property and was to run the complex solely until 1975. The complex was revamped with her amusements and fun of the fair, and given a new lease of life. Her attractions, as many will remember, included a giant fairground organ. She lived on the site. After her time, Wallace Brothers continued to run things, but the Fun Fair Park finally closed in 1980 when Belfast Corporation intimated it needed the space for the new zoo and associated car park facilities. The railway had closed in 1949, and the engine was consigned to Eastwood Scrapyard. It was preserved, though dilapidated, thanks mainly to two railway enthusiasts, Glyn Morris and Thomas Dorian, who worked with Eastwoods. Eventually it was purchased for £60 by a Mr. Watson and transported to Shane's Castle Railway, County Antrim. Sir William McAlpine bought it and transferred it to England. Finally, in 1972, it arrived back where it had started from 40 years earlier in New Romney. During 1975-76, it received a complete overhaul, financed by Sir William. He sold it back to its original owners, the RH&D Railway, for £25,000, where it still operates today, I understand, on special occasions. Quite a story, isn't it? But fitting that it has been restored. It cost £260 when purchased originally in 1926 by the RH&D Railway. Sir William apparently spent tens of thousands on it. A year or two ago, when speaking about the zoo, I mentioned a delightful book called Bellevue by Stuart McFetridge and published by Aztec Services. It is well worth reading, for it creates that feeling of fond nostalgia which many of us have about the place. Speaking for myself, nowadays when I visit the Cavehill, I find upon closing my eyes it easy to recall the sights and sounds of bygone years, and of the days as a boy when I trundled, or as locals describe it, trinnled my ordinary painted hard-boiled egg down the slopes of the hill at Easter time.
Jim O'Hagan, and taking us to the news at 4 o'clock, here is Fred Hanna, one of the stars of the Floral Hall, with a medley which includes Mountain Greenery.
1982 to